Those of you who are not familiar with this image should check out The Wizard of Oz. Okay, so we're not in Kansas anymore is the basic thing that I wanted to convey. Things are a little bit different. Thankfully, we have some guidelines, we have some information that can be helpful. The APA manual is one good place to start, but the upshot is that we're not an undergrad anymore, and things are kind of upside down. In the typical social scientific intro section, I'm talking about the first section of your typical journal article or master's thesis in a social science discipline, the structure is kind of the upside down version of your undergrad introduction. So if that's kind of where you're coming from, if that's your mindset, we're going to flip that around. We're going to turn it upside down, look at it in a funhouse mirror, and I'll say more about exactly what that is going to mean. In the old undergrad intro, you're typically introducing your whole paper in one paragraph. Sometimes it's a short paragraph, and sometimes the very first sentence sums up the entire paper. Am I right? Has anyone here written a paper that starts like this? In this paper, I will be examining the effects of prenatal care on long-term cognitive development. Okay, this is called the blunt statement, right? The blunt intro statement. So try to unlearn that. Something else that is familiar in undergrad introductions, and specifically the very beginning, the first sentence, is what's called a funnel opener. And this is something that I'm going to ask you to unlearn as well. What is a funnel? It is just a way of starting in the most broad way possible, the most general context, and then gradually narrowing down to the topic. So it sounds something like what I have on the screen, but you can imagine it applying to anything else. The crudest version of this funnel opener is something like, since the beginning of time, right? Men and women have failed to see eye to eye, or something, right? Something like that. So this is a very common habit, and if you've ever sort of lapsed into the funnel opener, that's another thing I'd like you to unlearn. Okay. All right, so no funnels. All right, so let's just briefly, I'm going to briefly give you an overview of what the American Psychological Association has to say as far as what belongs in the intro, because it's generally in line with what the 540 requirements are. And then I'm going to present some examples to you. First, some professional examples, and then a student example. And we're going to talk about exactly why these are good examples of how you want to organize the material in the introduction. So that's kind of what I'm going to be doing tonight. And then if there's time, I'll give you the opportunity at the end to look with hopefully fresh eyes at work that you've already begun to do on the intro paper. So that's sort of the roadmap. First, as far as the manual goes, you of course want to create interest in your topic and lay out some background information that the reader will need to know in order to understand why what you're writing about is important. And you're going to want to very clearly describe the paper itself. So you treat it like it's an object, so you get some distance from it, right? You describe it like it's a thing over there. But you also want to Another reason why you want to get some distance from it is because you want to clear up any potential confusion. So maybe your topic is easily confused with another topic, right? That's a common issue, and so you'll want to define terms that could be potentially confusing. In terms of the contents of the intro section, the APA is pretty clear on those as well. This is more or less in the order in which they should appear. The project statement or the statement of hypotheses would come at the end. But in your case, right, you're not doing an experiment, at least not in the intro paper. We're talking in hypothetical terms, really, about a project that has not been completed, right? So instead of a statement of hypothesis or hypotheses, that's at the end of the intro paper is where your research question would go. Now, your instructors have specified as well that you don't really need to define terms in the intro, but you should say that they will be defined later. Okay. The others should stand as is. So that's enough about what the APA manual has to say, and you can review the book on your own. I want to talk about more generally what you see when you start reading social scientific literature. There's a general order in which things go 99% of the time. And the first thing is called an opener. So the intro has an introduction. It's a few sentences or a paragraph, and it's always first. And then there's a brief review of relevant literature. And one purpose of this literature is to provide background information on your topic. Third, there's the purpose of the study. Fourth, and fifth, theoretical implications and definitions of variables. And then finally, the research project itself, the research question. And I'm just talking in general terms now. This general structure is what you usually encounter. It might be helpful for some to be reminded of the exact expectations for the 540 intro paper, but you can consult these online. This is on the Blackboard page. 3 basic expectations, and they're right here. You want to set up the lit review that would follow. You want to convey the focus of the paper. And finally, you want to justify why the topic is important and the reader should care about it. Okay. Some questions that I get from students often about this particular assignment include this one. What is the purpose of the literature review in the intro? I mean, I'm already reviewing literature in the lit review, so what's the difference? And my answer is that the literature review has a specific purpose in the introduction, and it's twofold. One, provide background information and establish the importance of the study. And two, lay out the relevant literature that's already been done on your topic. Or if there isn't any of that, scholarly literature of recent vintage that's on a related or very similar topic. And as you might have found in the research process, there might not be very much literature already published on exactly what you want to study. And that's not a bad thing. But in that case, it can feel very challenging to find references. Well, what do I cite in the introduction if there aren't any sources on my topic? And so what you have to do is look for research on similar topics or use slightly broader keywords. So you change your research process and cast a wider net. But this is a question that I commonly get, and I think it makes sense. But that's the long answer. The short answer is that you review the literature in order to show that there's a gap. You review the literature in order to show that there's a gap in it. You know, here's what's out there, but there's a limit to it. It doesn't really cover what needs to be covered. And so there's a very logical kind of transition that you can make from saying that to saying, here's what I'm doing and how I'm filling that gap. And we're going to look at some examples of how to do that tonight. Another question I often hear is, what if I don't know the theoretical implications of my work? And that's okay. Not every project is theoretical. So if you are thinking, well, I'm not really using theorists and theoretical implications just not relevant, think instead about what is significant about your work, because that's a priority in the introduction. What is significant? How are you contributing? And a logical question, I think, that might come up at that point in your process is, how do I know, right? How do I know what's significant about my work? And that comes from the research process, right? The more you research, the more you know what hasn't yet been done on your topic, and therefore what needs to be done and what you can contribute. And it's in that contribution, in making that contribution, that you do something of significance, right? So it comes out of the research process, hopefully. So this is kind of what I've already said, but some other things to kind of get the wheels turning in your mind. You can ask yourself these questions. Maybe there isn't anything on the exact narrow topic that I'm pursuing. Or maybe someone has yet to use a focus group to explore managers' attitudes towards, social network marketing, but everybody's doing the technology side, right? So think methodologically instead of topically, if that helps, geographically, temporally, and so forth. So you want to look for the gap. Here are some templates that you can use. So there are certain kind of linguistic structures that scholars will usually employ to signal how their research is making an original contribution, right? So here are some that you can kind of fill in the blanks. Of course, questions are welcome. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, so you can think not just about what original, maybe academic contribution your research makes, but how your research could meet a need on the part of industry. Yeah. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about openers and what some effective strategies are for opening up a topic. This is the first impression that your reader is going to have. The opener is a kind of test of you, so the stakes are kind of high, not to be overly dramatic. You want to keep it brief, so we're talking about like one paragraph. Okay. And I have a few strategies that I really like. These are things that when I'm looking at an effective paper, I usually see one of these. There's the recent trend opener, the anecdotal opener, or the relevant quotation, which is the hardest one because used incorrectly, the quotation opener is absolutely the worst kind of opener, but there's a way you can make it really good. All right, so let me start with the recent trend. So if you are making a kind of academic intervention, so you have noticed in doing research on social network marketing, to use the same example, that no one is really approaching the topic from the manager's perspective. And so you're making this cool intervention in the academic research on this topic. So your sort of opener could be a sort of brief kind of overview of the research on this topic, and you show how there's a trend that it's all focused on technology, right? Something like that. Or the trend could be a trend within industry. So you're kind of telling a story to invite your reader into the topic. That's number 2, the brief anecdote. And where do you find a compelling anecdote? Question?
For trends, could that also include like a statistic on how things have been changing in the recent years or something like that?
Yeah, so statistics are great for openers, and this is, this is a part of the paper where students will often fail to cite any references, and I think that that's a bad idea. So the first paragraph should be just as richly documented, as richly cited as every other paragraph in the paper. It's very important in paragraph 1 that you're as detailed and you're documenting as thoroughly as in any other part of it. So yeah, statistics, if they're documented, are great. But what if you're telling or you're interested in telling a story that really illustrates a social problem, like cyberbullying, for example? That's a recent social problem that's only emerged alongside the internet, right? Well, it would be really easy to tell a hypothetical story. But those easy choices are often really the poorest choices for that reason, okay? So it's very obvious. Imagine a person surfing the net and going into a chat room and meeting a stranger and falling in love, right? Okay, so that hypothetical is okay. But it'd be even better if you could search the New York Times for cyberbullying stories and actually, in your own words, tell a really interesting and actual story of someone's experience with cyberbullying, like as a victim, for example. So, yeah.
Would you start it like the summary of that story?
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like, since you're using that, I don't know how to properly explain it, but how would you kind of tie that into your intro? Like, how would you start it, I guess?
Yeah, so you would tell it like you'd begin at the beginning of the actual story, and you'd give some background information, you'd answer the journalistic questions, who, what, when, where, why, right? And then you transition at the end of that paragraph into the review of the literature, right? Scholars have also observed this troubling phenomenon, right? So it's a very organic kind of transition. It's important that if you're using this technique, that you put everything in your own words. That's one of the kind of challenging aspects of the anecdotal opener. But it's only effective if you don't quote a lot. Mm-hmm. Yeah, right here.
Use my own experience.
I think that it's rare when that works. But if you have a very compelling story and you're really the best person to illustrate the problem, then yeah. But otherwise, it can actually make you seem like someone who isn't objective. And it's very important in this kind of research writing that you appear objective. In the back?
If you're citing someone else's story, would you Okay, just making sure.
So you follow the same citation practices as you do in any other kind of situation. But, you know, if you're getting your story from the New York Times, you just cite that story, for example. Okay, so those are a few effective opener strategies. What are some to avoid the dictionary definition? Just don't ever go there. And don't cite, if you want to use statistics or facts, try to look for the ones that are counterintuitive, right? Or surprising, provocative in some way, not the ones that everybody knows, right? Everybody knows that you know, smoking is bad for your health, for example, but maybe not everybody knows, you know, how many people smoke despite living in blue states and being highly educated or something like that, right? So look for the interesting angle if you're going to cite statistics and facts. So for example, in a paper on tech management styles, a funnel opener would sound like this. For many years, managers have struggled, right? So hopefully you're getting the sense of why that's not going to work, right? It's vague, it's flat, it has nothing captivating that would come from an authentic, real, you know, example, right? Okay. Some other examples. So, you know, like I was saying about smoking in the blue box, we all know that smoking is unhealthy. So statistics that show that are kind of boring. But how many people still smoke despite the fact that we can document the fact that they've been exposed to all of this anti-smoking messaging and they're highly educated and so forth. So a surprising demographic tidbit is more interesting. In a paper about health marketing, it might be weak as an opener to talk about how health marketing is non-traditional. But a stronger opener might be that scholars tend to criticize health marketing. That's a little bit more surprising. You wouldn't expect that. So look for the surprising angle, the non-obvious angle or pattern. And keep in mind as you write your intro paper that in the academy and outside it, conflict is inherently interesting, and we locate conflict in academic contexts in disagreement and divergence. So anytime you see that happening, it's compelling to draw attention to it. But the same goes within industry. So wherever there's a kind of disagreement about management style or a new approach that's emerged, that is automatically kind of compelling. So the same thing that's true of art is true of life. I don't want to belabor the point about anecdotal openers, so you can review these examples on your own. I think I've kind of covered this already. So I just want to say just really briefly about, okay, how to handle the quotation opener if you're tempted to use this. Make sure, I think it's much better if you contextualize the quote inside an anecdote rather than just taking a quote from somewhere like Bartlett's Quotations or Google, which seems very trite and hacky, right? Like the comedians say, you don't want to be like Banya from Seinfeld, right? You want to, if you're going to use a quotation, have it be from someone who's directly related to your topic and put that quotation inside a story about that person. Don't just have, okay, someone important who said something that's kind of related to your topic. I would recommend not doing that, right? So these are some ways you can make the tactic work. All right, so I kind of want to move on from openers. I think that's enough about openers. Let's get into the body of it. And so if you've got a device with you, I'm going to be consulting a few articles that I've uploaded in the controlling documents section. You don't have to consult them right now, but it might make it easier to follow along if you do. So if you go to controlling documents, and then in the writing workshop folder, you'll see a sample that's called branding access offers. So I'll give you a minute if you want to look for that.
We'll have access to this PowerPoint.
You will have access to this, and there's a recording that hopefully is functional, and so you'll have access to that as well. Okay, so it's branding access offers is the article. I'm just going to jump right into it. Okay, so in this article, the authors are exploring a research question related to this new phenomenon where companies are kind of converting their products to services. So instead of buying a car, you sort of buy occasional access to a car if you want one for a trip, right? So it's kind of like renting instead of owning, right? But these authors were kind of wondering, well, what effect does that have on the brand? And are people who would otherwise buy renting instead, and therefore negatively affecting the other segment, right? Excuse me, of the business. So this is how the authors framed that question. It's in the red box, and it's on page 575 of the article, towards the end of the first paragraph on that page. Firms thus need to clearly understand how established owners of the brand react differently to this offer than non-owners, and if the access offer dilutes the value of ownership. Okay, so just wanted to kind of lay this out there, but notice how the very subtle way that the authors presented their research question. They're not hitting you over the head, right? Like, here's my research question, right? And they're as they're communicating the question, they're conveying what's significant about it, right? They're meeting a need when they're addressing this question, right? And that need is on the part of businesses, right? Who should consider the potential implications of this choice to convert products to services. But if this were your research question, how might you go about crafting the introduction around it? Like, how would you begin it, for example? Would you tell a story about it? Would you look for, statistics about this phenomenon as it's happening? Let's look at what they did, and if you scroll up to the beginning of the document, you get this. This is the first paragraph. Recently, services that provide access to a physical good for a short period of time have gained tremendous importance in various consumer goods industries. Technological advancements have made more flexible offers in the so-called rented goods services category feasible, such as the short-term and short-notice rental of a car that is booked via a smartphone app. Societal trends towards more efficient resource use, as well as the general trend towards sharing or collaborative consumption, have made such services even more appealing. As a consequence, more and more companies start to offer their own branded goods to consumers as an access service. So would you have made this choice? Do you think this is an effective way to frame the issue? What these folks did, and there are multiple authors, is talk about recent trends, right, that illustrate this issue. And they document every single sentence. So you see how the level of citation, even though this is the first paragraph, is very high. And they're not citing the same sources every time. They're using a wide range of different authorities to kind of tell that story. Notice also that they don't come out and say anything very obvious and blunt, like this paper will explore, the implications of. They're counting on their reader to sort of follow along, right? And trust that they'll get to it eventually. So this is an example of a professional group of authors using that anecdotal type of opener to frame their question, to open the topic. Okay, so that's one professional example, and if we have time, we'll look at some other ones. But I wanted to show you a student paper that was successful at exactly this assignment. And I think the student received a 92. So this is an A-range paper. And this is the way the student presented her research question. So this is at the end of the intro, last paragraph of the intro paper, we have this sentence starting with a transitional word, right? Because a good writer is always making smooth transitions, right, between ideas. Specifically, it is worth asking whether a strong brand will necessarily result in a successful crowdfunding campaign, and conversely, whether an innovative crowdfunding campaign will help strengthen a brand or create a viable brand where none had previously existed. 2 research questions, not a single question mark. And yet, we know that this is the research question, right? This is someone who's very kind of carefully revising her work. Obviously, she started with 2 questions, but it sounds more formal, more confident to present it as a declaration, right? So this is an example of a successful framing of the question, right? Framing of the question. But how do you think this person, or how would you, if you were this person, begin the paper? This is how she did it. And so she's writing a paper on the relationship between crowdfunding and branding. And so she did research just to craft an interesting opener, an interesting first paragraph. And she did a lot of research just to find compelling examples of this phenomenon to sort of interest the reader and illustrate how it's an authentic, real thing that's happening, right? And so we have you know about the Veronica Mars movie, right? And Garden State, well, not Garden State, but the one that he did after that, right, Zach Braff. So maybe the examples, maybe one of those could have been off the beaten track, but you get the point, right? So the opener requires research to be really effective, and this is all in her own words, no direct quotations, all paraphrased, all flowing really well, thoroughly documented. 6 different articles are cited in the first paragraph alone, 9 citations total, 200 plus words for paragraph 1. In the paper as a whole, we have 16 sources and 49 inline citations, just to give you a sense of how thoroughly you want to research your paper. And this is in line with what the APA says and what I've said before, I think, right? Every key point should have a source. And so you're not, that's what you're striving for, right? You might not hit exactly that target, but that's a goal. Okay, this is the way that this writer organized her ideas leading up to that research question that I shared with you. Started out with the examples, and then showed how the phenomenon actually extended beyond just Hollywood. to sort of further establish its importance. And then we have a lit review that's, I think, 3 paragraphs long that has these 5 topics. And it's very clear that each, when she's referencing sources on each of these subtopics within the lit review. So as a general rule of thumb, outlining is a good idea. We might not all be linear thinkers who will have lettered outlines, but I think it's a good idea to really organize this paper in advance to make sure that you do everything that's expected and everything is more or less in the right order, and you're leading up to that research question. Okay. And this is just kind of how she hits those marks. When it comes to making your research question really compelling, there are some things you can keep in mind. Don't forget to save it for the end. Don't forget to include a rationale. In other words, what makes this question necessary, right? It can be the fact that no one has sought the answer yet, or it can be the fact that there is a real need on the part of some industry folks for the answer that you will be hopefully providing. And try to be as efficient and direct as possible and to state it as one question or sentence. Don't use overstatements like this study will prove or demonstrate once and for all, so on and so forth. That actually backfires. That kind of overconfidence actually makes you look weak, and you want to remember that it's a scientific process, and so your study should be designed to be iterable, and someone else could come along and repeat it and test it, right? So we're not settling the question once and for all anyway. Don't actually take a very clear position on it, because you should remember that at this point in the larger project, the larger hypothetical project, you're not answering the question. That's for the results in the discussion. So even in the longer version of this that you may write in the future, at this point, at the end of the intro, you're not going to say what the answer is anyway. Okay, so that was, yeah, answer your question or take a clear position on the issue. And then I thought we could look at another couple examples if we have time. So this one is in the same place. It's in the controlling documents in the writing workshop folder, but it's called Does Twitter Matter? And then there's a section in there called the Twitter effect controversy, and that's the first section. It's what would be the intro. But you should remember, of course, that in your intro paper, there is no like intro heading, right? It's just the title of the paper at the top of the page. Okay, you knew that. Okay, so are we there? Okay, great. So as you look at the section, would you please look and see if you find these things? Is there an opener? Is there a rationale? Is there a literature review? Is there a significance? Okay, since I need to let you, have a snack and so forth before your long class and let the other instructors set up, I'm going to ask if you have seen in this example of a professional introduction, any of the things that I've kind of said are standard. These things, the opener, the review, the justification, the significance. Anyone want to share? Uh-huh.
The first sentence of the Twitter effect controversy, I took that as an intro, right?
Yeah, this is the beginning of the intro.
Because she's a strong word, like, or whoever wrote it, the power of microblogging to rapidly spread information. Like, that's kind of an interesting hook already. So I took that as like an interesting intro.
Great. So the use of the word power kind of makes it seem important and compelling, right? As opposed to a kind of softer word or a vaguer kind of description of the phenomenon. And we've got a kind of narrative opening then where we're reminded about the role of microblogging in recent international events. What about where later on or below that, where the project itself is described? And we get into the lit review, like here on the left-hand side in this "If Twitter Exists" paragraph. Here, the author or authors are really showing us why it's very important, this phenomenon, right? Why the Twitter effect is really important. And in a subtle way, then, we're getting the impression that it's really important that we understand the paper, right? Because if this is how important the Twitter effect is, if it exists, then whether or not it exists, which is the point of the paper, is that much more important. And that's very thoroughly documented here. So there's a whole long paragraph basically justifying the study itself, right? And so that's kind of doing double duty there, justifying the project and showing how significant it is. So these are different roles that literature can have in your own paper, contextualizing the project and justifying it, in addition to just showing the recent trends. So if there was a question in your mind, okay, what role does research have in my intro? I hope I've given you 3 good answers. And if there is a question in your mind about what goes in this paper, I hope I've given you a bunch more. And if you want, I would encourage you to take a few minutes before class starts and take a look at your draft if you have one, and maybe with fresh eyes, and you can generate some new ideas or strategies. But I will let you take a break. Thank you, and you know how to reach me if you have questions. Can I have the sign-in sheet wherever it is? Has everybody signed in? No?